Welcome to Mr. Hutchings History, where the past comes alive. Let's dive into today's story.
Welcome to the deep dive. We've got some really interesting stuff to dig into today.
Oh, yeah.
You bet. Our listener sent in some fascinating material on Elijah Muhammad and Malcolm X.
Two hugely influential figures.
For sure. And our listener wants to understand their impact.
On Black nationalism?
Exactly. And the civil rights movement and just how historians view their legacies.
It's complicated.
It is. So where do we even begin?
Well, it's a topic that's full of nuance and sparks a lot of debate.
Right, because both men were incredibly influential.
But also controversial.
Definitely controversial.
Right.
To really get a handle on their successes and their failures.
We really need to look at the whole picture.
Yeah, like the historical context.
All the different opinions from historians.
We do have this one podcast episode called Success and Controversy, Elijah Muhammad and Malcolm X.
That sounds like a great place to start.
It does. It really gets into their achievements.
Yeah, it's the criticisms.
Yeah, and all those different ways people interpret their legacies.
I'm ready when you are.
Okay, so Elijah Muhammad, he rose to lead the Nation of Islam in the 1930s.
The NOI, right?
Yes, the NOI. It's a religious and political movement all about Black empowerment and self-reliance.
Founded in the 1930s.
And Elijah Muhammad, he becomes the leader.
After the founder, Wallace Fard, disappeared.
Right. What a story. And his leadership really shaped the NOI for decades.
It did. Under his leadership, they really pushed for Black self-reliance.
And economic independence, too.
They built a whole network of NRI-owned businesses.
Really? Like what?
Restaurants, bakeries, grocery stores, everything.
Wow. That must resonated with Black communities.
Absolutely. At the time, Black people faced so much discrimination.
And economic hardship.
It was a system designed to hold them back.
So this message of self-sufficiency, it must have been incredibly powerful.
Oh, it was. It gave them a sense of agency, a way to build their own future.
Outside of a system that was rigged against them.
Exactly.
It wasn't all smooth sailing, though, was it?
No, definitely not Muhammad's teachings. They had this strong element of rejecting white culture.
And advocating for separation.
Which was very controversial.
And then there's the story of Yakub.
Right, the Black scientist who supposedly created the white race.
Yeah, that's a pretty wild idea.
It's definitely seen as divisive, even pseudoscientific.
I can see why. But it's interesting, even with all that controversy.
Some historians still argue that those beliefs actually fostered Black pride and empowerment.
Really? How so?
They helped create a sense of identity and purpose, separate from the dominant white culture.
The one that had marginalized them for so long.
Exactly.
So it's like a double-edged sword.
That's a good way to put it. Promotes self-sufficiency on one hand.
But fuels separation on the other.
And that's why it's still so hotly debated today.
These guys, they really challenge us to think critically.
Yeah, oh, easy answers here.
Okay, ready to shift gears to Malcolm X.
Oh, absolutely. His story is incredible.
He went from a troubled youth to the NOI's star spokesperson.
Quite a transformation.
Yeah. And his words, they really had an impact.
He was a captivating speaker, calling for Black empowerment.
By any means necessary, right.
Got it. He really shined a light on the inequalities facing Black Americans.
It sounds pretty radical.
Oh, it was compared to, say, Martin Luther King Jr.'s nonviolence.
Was his approach that different from King's?
It was more militant. He believed in fighting back against oppression.
Even if it meant using force.
He wasn't advocating violence for its own sake, but he challenged the idea of turning the other cheek.
It resonated with a younger generation who wanted change.
They were tired of waiting. They wanted to see action.
So while King focused on changing hearts and minds,
Malcolm X was tapping into a different energy.
The energy of those who wanted to see immediate change.
For sure. And it appealed to those who felt that a more forceful approach was needed.
And then his pilgrimage to Mecca in 1964, it changed everything.
Yes. His experience in Mecca with Muslims of all races was transformative.
He embraced a more inclusive form of Islam.
And rejected the NOI's racial theology.
That was a huge turning point.
It was. But a lot of people questioned if it was genuine.
They thought it was just for show.
Some did. But many historians believe it was a sincere evolution of his beliefs.
Like Manning Marable. He wrote a whole biography about Malcolm X.
Exactly. He argues that this shift was real, that Malcolm X was moving towards a more humanist perspective.
So he saw the fight for equality as a universal struggle.
Not just limited to one race.
Wow. So we've got these two incredibly complex figures.
Each with their own approaches and controversies.
How do historians even begin to make sense of all this?
Well, it's less about reconciling those different perspectives.
And more about understanding the different schools of thought.
Exactly. like the revisionist historians, for example.
Okay, what's their take on Elijah Muhammad and Malcolm X?
They see them as pioneers, paving the way for the Black Power movement.
Even though their methods were controversial.
Yes, they acknowledge the complexities, but they focus on the positive contributions,
Like fostering Black pride.
promoting economic empowerment.
And challenging the status quo.
They argue that progress isn't always pretty
So they look past the divisive rhetoric.
and focus on the impact,
It's like acknowledging the messiness of history.
and accepting that sometimes progress comes from unexpected places.
What about Black nationalist historians? Do they see things differently?
They do. They celebrate Muhammad and Malcolm X as symbols of Black self-reliance.
And independence.
For them, those calls for separation, they weren't failures.
They were part of a long tradition of Black self-determination.
Precisely. They value Black economy, even if it means separating from white society.
They see it as essential for true liberation.
Exactly. And what's interesting is how they view Malcolm X's evolution.
His move towards a more inclusive perspective.
They see it as a natural progression, expanding Black nationalist goals
From focusing on Black America.
to envisioning global Black solidarity.
Wow, connecting the struggle in the U.S. to a worldwide movement.
It's fascinating how these different lenses shape our understanding.
Are there any other schools of thought we should be aware of?
There are some historians take a more psychological approach.
Like focusing on personal experiences.
Exactly.
Mhm.
For example, some scholars have looked at Malcolm X's childhood trauma.
Trying to see how it shaped his later radicalism.
All right. There's a controversial approach, though.
Why is that?
Some Black nationalist scholars argue that focusing on trauma downplays the role of systemic racism,
So it's important to consider all those factors.
the personal and the political.
And to recognize that they can sometimes be in tension with each other.
Absolutely. Now, where do mainstream civil rights historians fit into all of this?
That's a great question. They probably have a different perspective on Elijah Muhammad and Malcolm X.
They do. They tend to be more critical, especially of their radicalism.
The emphasis on separation and militancy.
Yes. They view it as potentially hindering the progress of the civil rights movement.
So they see them as working against integration and nonviolent resistance.
In a way, yes. The mainstream narrative often centers on figures like Martin Luther King Jr.
And pushing for equality within the existing system.
Right. So from that perspective, the emphasis on separation could be seen as counterproductive.
So we've got this whole spectrum of interpretations.
Some see them as heroes, others as obstacles, and everything in between.
It's almost impossible to say definitively whether they were successful or not.
And that's the point. Their legacies are complex. To understand their impact
We have to grapple with all those different perspectives.
and really dig into the nuances of their actions and beliefs.
Okay, so let's try to do that. What would you say are some of their most significant successes?
And failures too.
Of course, we can't cover everything.
But what stands out to you?
Well, for me, it's Malcolm X's influence on a whole generation of Black youth.
He gave voice to their anger and frustration,
And that call for Black empowerment, it really resonated.
especially with those who felt excluded from the more moderate approaches to civil rights.
So his legacy is one of empowerment.
Yes, of challenging the status quo, even if his methods were controversial.
And his embrace of Pan-Africanism had a lasting impact too, right?
Absolutely. It inspired movements advocating for Black autonomy and global solidarity.
He broadened the scope of the struggle, connecting it to a global movement.
Now, what about Elijah Muhammad? What stands out to you about his successes?
Well, his focus on Black self-reliance and economic independence.
Those were key components of the NOI's message.
But did those ideas actually lead to tangible improvements in Black communities?
They did.
Yeah.
Under Muhammad's leadership, the NOI built a network of businesses.
Providing employment and economic opportunities.
Exactly. They had restaurants, bakeries, grocery stores, even farms and manufacturing plants.
Wow. That's impressive.
It was about taking control of their own economic destiny.
And rejecting that dependence on white society.
It was a powerful message. It showed what was possible when the community came together.
So even if people didn't agree with all of his teachings,
They couldn't deny that he was making a real difference in people's lives.
and the NOI also created a strong sense of community.
Absolutely. It gave people a sense of belonging, of purpose.
Especially for those who felt marginalized and dehumanized by society,
It was like building a parallel society
with its own values and institutions.
and even its own economy.
Wow. It was a bold experiment with both positive and negative consequences.
Definitely. But it's clear that both Elijah Muhammad and Malcolm X achieved real change.
They were controversial,
But they left a lasting impact.
which is what makes them so fascinating to study.
They force us to confront the complexities of the Black freedom struggle.
And to recognize that there's no single path to liberation.
The answer isn't always clear-cut.
And that's what makes this so interesting.
Absolutely. We've talked a lot about how historians view these two guys.
Elijah Muhammad and Malcolm X.
Yeah, but what about their actual impact?
Like how their work led to concrete change.
That's the big question, right? It's one thing to have ideas.
But how did those ideas play out in the real world?
Exactly. Let's start with Malcolm X.
Okay, his call for Black empowerment by any means necessary.
It really resonated with people, especially those who felt like the pace of change was just too slow.
Like things weren't happening fast enough.
Exactly. He became a symbol for a whole generation,
Those who were disillusioned with the nonviolent approach,
which a lot of civil rights leaders were advocating for at the time.
he really tapped into that sense of urgency.
And frustration, too. That was building in Black communities,
So even though he rejected integration,
which seemed to go against the mainstream civil rights movement,
did that actually pave the way for the Black Power movement?
one that emphasized self-determination and racial pride.
That's what I'm thinking.
That's a really interesting point. You see, even though Malcolm X criticized some civil rights leader,
He wasn't on board with everything they were doing.
right, he still wanted to see Black people liberated.
He just had a different idea of how to get there.
Exactly. He was pushing for Black liberation just through a different lens,
So not necessarily integration into a white society.
more like creating a separate and empowered Black identity.
And his embrace of Pan-Africanism.
Oh, that's important. Advocating for solidarity among all people of African descent.
Worldwide.
It broadened the whole scope of the movement
Connected the struggles of Black Americans to a global fight.
against colonialism and oppression, exactly.
So it became about more than just integrating into white society.
It was about forging a new path, creating a distinct Black identity.
Wow. So his perceived failure, his rejection of integration,
It actually might have led to a more radical movement.
and some might argue a more impactful one.
It's like these things can backfire in a positive way.
It's full of contradictions.
It really is. It shows you just how unpredictable social movements can be.
And how one person's perceived failure.
Can become the spark for a whole new wave of activism.
So what about Elijah Muhammad?
Okay, let's talk about him.
We talked about the NOI's focus on Black self-reliance.
And economic independence, right?
Yeah, did those ideas actually translate into real improvements?
I mean, for Black communities.
It can't just be talk,
Right.
right?
Oh, it was more than just talk. Under Muhammad's leadership, the NOI actually created a whole network of businesses.
Wow, really?
Yeah, they provided employment and economic opportunities specifically for Black people.
Like what kinds of businesses?
Restaurants, bakeries, grocery stores. They even had farms and manufacturing plants.
That's incredible. So they were creating their own economy.
In a way, yes. Those businesses were more than just places to buy and sell things.
They were symbols.
Of Black self-sufficiency. They represented a total rejection of economic dependence on white society.
Which had been forced on Black people for centuries.
It was about taking control, shaping their own destiny.
And I bet it inspired others to pursue economic empowerment, too.
Both inside and outside the NOI, definitely.
Even if people didn't agree with all of his ideas.
They had to acknowledge that he was doing something real, something tangible.
Making a difference in people's lives.
And beyond the economic impact, the NOI also built a strong sense of community.
We talked about that a bit earlier.
It provided a sense of belonging, a purpose.
Especially for those who felt marginalized by the larger society. It's like they created their own world.
A parallel society.
With their own values and their own institutions.
And even their own economy, as you said.
A bold experiment.
For sure. It had both positive and negative consequences.
But it was definitely significant. Both Elijah Muhammad and Malcolm X.
They were controversial.
But they also brought about real change.
And that's what makes them so compelling, so worth studying.
They force us to confront the complexities of the Black freedom struggle.
And to understand that there isn't always a single path to liberation.
So it's not a simple question of success or failure.
No, it's much more nuanced than that.
I'm realizing that to understand their success,
You have to look at it from multiple perspectives.
consider all those different historical interpretations.
And critically examine all the evidence.
Because there's no one definitive narrative when it comes to these two.
That's for sure.
Okay, so we've discussed their impact.
And how historians view them.
And the ongoing debates surrounding their legacies.
So, for someone trying to make sense of all this today,
What's the key takeaway?
for me, the biggest takeaway is that their ideas and their struggles are still relevant.
Even though they were products of a specific time and place.
Absolutely. The questions they raised about race, identity, power, and justice.
We're still grappling with those same questions today. So their legacies go beyond just that historical context.
They transcend it. We see their influence in contemporary movements for social justice.
And the fight for racial equality.
The push for a more just and equitable society, it's all connected.
They were complex and controversial, no doubt.
But they were also undeniable forces for change.
They challenged the status quo, pushed boundaries,
and forced people to confront uncomfortable truths about America.
This has been really insightful. I feel like I understand them better now.
I'm glad to hear that. But remember, this is just a starting point.
There's always more to learn.
Exactly. There's so much more to explore about their lives, their ideas, and their impact.
This is just a framework.
A way to start understanding their complex legacies.
Honestly, this has sparked a whole new set of questions for me.
That's what we want. The best deep dives leave you wanting more.
They make you curious. They make you want to keep learning.
And exploring.
So where does all this leave us? We started out trying to understand the success of Elijah Muhammad and Malcolm X, and we've learned that success, well, it's not so simple.
Not when you're talking about figures like these.
Exactly. It's really hard to define.
Yeah, it's not just a yes or no answer.
It's so much more than that. It's fascinating,
What is?
how even today, their legacies are still being debated.
Like people are still trying to figure them out.
Yeah. Were they heroes? Were they villains? Did they help or hurt the cause of racial equality?
Big questions.
Huge questions, and there are no easy answers.
It seems like those questions, they're still very relevant today.
Oh, absolutely.
Yeah.
And maybe that's part of their success,
What do you mean?
The fact that they spark these conversations that are still going on, that we're still having now, all these years later.
Exactly. They challenge the status quo. They force people to think about race and power and justice in America.
And that's a powerful thing.
It really is. It's a form of impact that goes way beyond any specific policies or achievements.
So even if they didn't accomplish everything they set out to do,
It changed the way people thought about these issues.
and that's something that continues to this day,
And they inspired future generations to keep fighting for liberation.
to pick up the torch and carry it forward.
That's a great way to put it. They planted seeds that grew into movements and ideas that are still shaping our world.
It's like their legacy keeps evolving.
It does. And it reminds us that social change, it's rarely a straight line.
It's messy, right?
It is. It's full of twists and turns and contradictions.
We see that with Elijah Muhammad and Malcolm X.
Absolutely. Both working towards Black empowerment, but with very different approaches.
And sometimes what looks like a failure at the time,
Can actually lead to something positive down the road.
like it can open up new possibilities, new ways of thinking.
Exactly. Think about Malcolm X's break with the Nation of Islam.
It was a controversial move.
It was, and it alienated some of his supporters.
Yeah.
But it also freed him to embrace a more inclusive vision of Islam.
And to connect with a global human rights movement.
You went from a national figure to an international one.
And Elijah Muhammad, even though his separatist ideology was really controversial,
His focus on Black economic self-reliance,
it had a real impact.
it did. He showed what was possible when a community took control of its own economic future.
They didn't have to rely on the system that had been oppressing them.
They could build something of their own.
So when we talk about the success of these two men,
We have to remember that it's complicated.
it's not a simple answer.
It's about looking at the long game, the ripple effects of their actions and their ideas,
It's about the changes in thinking that they sparked, the movements they inspired.
and the impact that continues to unfold even today.
It's a legacy that's still being written.
And that's pretty amazing when you think about it.
I think it is. It's been an incredible journey, exploring their lives and their legacies.
It's been a privilege to share this deep dive with you.
And with our listener, of course.
I hope they've enjoyed it as much as we have.
I'm sure they have. This has definitely given me a lot to think about.
That's the goal, right? To spark curiosity, to leave people wanting to learn more.
Exactly. To keep digging deeper, to keep questioning.
And to never stop exploring these complex and fascinating issues.
I think we've accomplished that today.
I hope so. Thanks for joining me on this journey.
It's been a pleasure, as always.
Until next time, keep diving deep.